Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. This is Console Wars Part 3, the 16-bit era. So this is the third of my ongoing Console Wars retrospective, look back, whatever you want to call it. And today we're up to the 16-bit era. Now, dipshits and fuckwads will tell you the 16-bit era began with the NEC Hudson Soft TurboGrafx 16 PC engine, and these people don't understand technology, and they need to be reminded that that's an 8-bit system and does not belong in the 16-bit era. Now that I have offended you and pissed you off, please watch the rest of this video. Thank you very much. The 16-bit era starts with the Mega Drive in Japan, brought over to the US as the Sega Genesis, and continues with the Super Nintendo Entertainment System and side quest, or side steps, I'll say, into the SNK Neo Geo AES home console. Those are the three consoles that make up the 16-bit era. Now, we're not talking about the add-ons. We're not talking about the CD-ROM stuff. We're just talking about the core 16-bit console systems. So we're going to start with the worst and work our way up to the best. We're going to start with the Neo Geo. Now, the Neo Geo, on the surface, looks like a pretty good system. It literally plays exact replicas of arcade games at home. Comes with an arcade joystick. It's a sleek-looking system. Never mind the fact that it's expensive as all fucking get out. Let's just say, if it had been priced affordably, or if capitalism worked like it's supposed to and everybody could afford one or whatever, yeah, the Neo Geo on paper looks like a good system. In practice, the Neo Geo sucks. And the reason why I say this is because the MVS was very loaded in its software library. The vast majority of games released for the Neo Geo were 2D fighting games. That's not to say there weren't other great games on the system like Metal Slug, Bust-A-Move, and that's it. Those were the two good ones. The rest were fighting games. There was nothing else on the Neo Geo. There are other games on it, but they're not worth a shit. They're all fighting games. There's a couple of, 2D side-scrolling beat-em-ups, but, again, those are just basically fighting games or whatever. They're not one-on-one fighting games, but they're still fighting games. And there weren't very many of them, and the ones there were weren't very good. So, if you liked shooters, there were only a couple, not enough to justify buying the system. If you liked 2D platformers, there were zero, there were none, so you couldn't get your fix that way. If you liked puzzle games, there was one or two, one being good, the other one being forgettable. There were only a couple of sports games, and they weren't great. To my knowledge, there weren't any racing games. To my knowledge, there weren't any RPGs of any kind. There were hardly any fantasy-themed games at all. There were no... I shouldn't say there were no run-and-guns. Obviously, Metal Slug is a run-and-gun. There are no hack-and-slash beat-em-ups. There are no ninja-based games that I know of, other than Samurai Shodown, which is samurais. Other than, again, fighting games. But there are no Ninja Turtle type games, or Double Dragon type games, or Ninja Gaiden type games. There are no games based on movies, and there are no third-party fighting games or third-party arcade games like Mortal Kombat or Street Fighter or Raiden or Galaga or fucking anything. There's nothing. It's all SNK games. And it's 70% fighting games, and the other 30% is a hodgepodge of random shit that just isn't worth it. So the Neo Geo has other problems. It's expensive. The games were expensive. The library was very, very, very limiting. However, of the three 16-bit consoles, it was the most graphically impressive. And so I would say if you were rich and you had the money to buy one, it was worth buying, as long as you also had one of the other two or both of the other two 16-bit consoles. But as your only home console, as your primary home console, oh my god, you would have been disappointed. You would have got bored by the time you were playing your third or fourth port of King of Fighters. You know, it wasn't enough. Let's go to the next two. The next two are the Sega Genesis and the Super NES. And I'm not going to declare which one is better than the other. I'm going to talk about them side by side. The Sega Genesis is known for its more arcade style games, so you have a lot of action games. The Super Nintendo is more known for your platformer and puzzle games, as well as your RPGs, role-playing games. Both consoles have a fair number of fighting games. Both consoles have a fair number of 2D platformers. Both consoles have a fair number of arcade ports. Both consoles have a fair number of run and guns and hack and slash and beat 'em ups, etc. Both have fairly well-rounded libraries. Sega does better with action and sci-fi games. Nintendo does better with cartoony style games. There are exceptions on both sides. Obviously, Sega has Sonic, which is a very cartoony style 2D platformer. And Nintendo has Super Metroid, which is a very sci-fi action game. So, you know, they're comparable. Their software libraries are comparable. If you only owned one or the other, whichever one you owned, you are most likely satisfied with. If you only owned a Genesis, you are happy with the Genesis because it gave you everything you wanted. If you only owned a Super Nintendo, you are happy with the Super Nintendo because it gave you everything you wanted, whichever one you preferred. I was fortunate enough that I got a job when I was 12 years old, and I was able to save up money and buy myself a Super Nintendo after my parents had already bought me a Sega Genesis. So I was able to experience both of them in their heyday. So I didn't have to pick sides. I didn't have to choose one or the other. I did pick the Genesis first, but that's a whole messy, complicated story that I've already told a time or two. But I was happy with my Genesis. I was happy with my Super NES. Overall, the 16-bit era is probably my personal favorite era in video games. And I just love it. So some of the highlights on the Genesis. The Genesis has multiple Sonic the Hedgehog games. All of them are fantastic. Sonic 2 is my personal favorite. But I would argue Sonic 3 and Knuckles is the best, even though Sonic 2 is my personal favorite. I think you could argue that Sonic 3 and Knuckles is the better game. But they're all good. Vector Man is pretty good. Both ToeJam and Earl games are pretty good. Altered Beast is pretty good. Shining Force is pretty good. Phantasy Star is pretty good. Fucking Afterburner is pretty good. Space Harrier is good. Lots of first-party games. And then you got third-party games like The Amazing Spider-Man, you got Batman, you got Battletoads, you got Double Dragon, you got Castlevania Bloodlines, you got all the Mortal Kombats, all the Street Fighters, you've got not Killer Instinct, excuse me, you got Primal Rage, you've got Samurai Showdown, you've got tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of racing games. You got a shit ton of side-scrolling shooters or shoot-em-ups, vertical and horizontal scrolling. You got just fucking everything, man. You got it all. It's all there. Super Nintendo, likewise. You got heavy hitters like Super Mario World, SimCity, Donkey Kong Country, Star Fox. You've got Doom. You've got, again, the Mortal Kombat, the Street Fighters. You got Mega Man X, Super Castlevania 4. You've got, what else is there? Fucking Legend of Zelda, Super Metroid. You got Super Mario Kart. You got Mario All-Stars. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. You got great games like Final Fantasy 3, 6 in Japan. You've got ActRaiser, Chrono Trigger, fucking, God, so many great games. So many great fucking games. Some people would argue, especially Nintendo fans, that the Super Nintendo is probably the greatest game console of all time. I'm not likely to argue with these people. Now, I'll be right there to say, well, don't forget the Genesis, please, because it's damn good, too. But the Super Nintendo has got a shit ton of great fucking games. Classics, AAA games, blockbuster games. Just fucking amazing, iconic games. Just too many goddamn games to count. And they're both great fucking systems. Now, what defined the 16-bit era more than the 8-bit era is, one, better graphics, better sound, obviously. But also, two, both Sega and Nintendo were more willing to take risks and gamble on gimmicks. So there were a lot of gimmicks in the 16-bit era. Yeah, you had light gun games on the NES, but both systems had their own unique take on the light gun game. You had the Minister on the Genesis and the Super Scope 6 on the Super Nintendo. Both treated light gun games differently than they were done on the NES. They both had multi-taps. They both had multiplayer sports games. They were both heavy hitters on the sports titles. Genesis was better at sports than Super Nintendo. This is a fact. Don't at me. But that's not to say the Super Nintendo didn't have good sports games too, because it did. And then you had a lot of multi-platform third-party games like that were on both systems that were great. You had fucking what else? What all did you have? I can't even think right now. You had Ninja Turtles on both systems, Hyperstone Heist on the Genesis, Turtles in Time on the Super Nintendo. You had Battletoads and Double Dragon was on both systems. Cool Spot was on both systems. I think Bubsy was on both systems. I'm pretty sure Rocket Knight Adventures was on both systems. Earthworm Jim was on both systems, And then you had, like, this weird phenomena where you'd have the same game on both systems in name only, but they were completely different games. Like, you had a Jurassic Park game on the Super Nintendo, you had an X-Men game on the Super Nintendo, and you had, what was the other one I wanted to say? Aladdin game on the Super Nintendo. But you had a completely different Jurassic Park, a completely different Aladdin, and a completely different X-Men game on the Genesis. And I'm not saying one is better than the other, I'm just saying they were different. Now, if you're going to nitpick over tech specs like a nerd and look at their, and you're going to compare them across the board on paper, you could make a case that the Super Nintendo is better at some things than the Genesis, but you could also make a case that the Sega Genesis is better at some things than the Super Nintendo. But in practical reality, they were identical in terms of not necessarily raw horsepower, but in performance. In actual realized performance, they were identical. Super Nintendo tended to have more colors and more sound channels, where Genesis tended to be faster, had more sprites on screen, tended to move quicker. Again, that goes with the faster. And, of course, could load faster and just had more action-oriented games. And Super Nintendo, again, mostly just had more colors. They both were pretty much the same resolution. They were both pretty much the same level of detail in the graphics for the most part. So you can't really say one was better than the other in terms of practical reality. Now, we could argue over the software library all day long, but any game you could name me on the Super Nintendo, I can find a game that's just as good on the Sega Genesis and vice versa all day long. Now, let's talk about things that came into prominence during the 16-bit era. Now, you had a handful of role-playing games on the NES and home computers prior to the NES. A handful. You had a couple of Ultima games. You had a couple of D&D-based games. You had a couple of Wizardry games. You had a couple of Final Fantasies. And you had a couple of Dragon Quest or Dragon Warrior games. Not much else. But by and large, these games on the 8-bit systems were not very good, and they were not very successful, and they did not light up the sales charts. In the 16-bit era, the role-playing game really took off. It is widely regarded among gamers that the Super Nintendo is one of the better consoles for JRPGs in particular. It did have some Western-style RPGs, but there wasn't a big distinction between the two, a divide, like there is today, where you can point to this and say, these traits define Western RPGs, these traits represent JRPGs. Back then, they were a lot more similar than they are now, because the technology was a lot more primitive, and there just wasn't a lot of advancement in that regard. So role-playing games really came into their own in the 16-bit era. Now, I will agree with most people, that the Super Nintendo does, in general, have more role-playing games than the Genesis, and for the most part, it tends to have better role-playing games than the Genesis. So if you happen to be a fan of role-playing games, and JRPGs in particular, you probably lean towards Super Nintendo. However, you could still get your RPG fix on the Genesis. You had 3 Phantasy Star games, which were all pretty good. You had 2 Shining Force games. You had Landstalker. You had D&D, Warriors of the Eternal Sun, and a few others. I'm not going to sit here and list them all. You had others. You had role-playing games on the Genesis that were all pretty good role-playing games. So to say the Genesis didn't have role-playing games is a fabrication. It did. And it even had, role-playing games that were nothing like role-playing games on the Super Nintendo. Just like Super Nintendo had a handful of role-playing games that were unique to it that didn't have comparable counterparts on the Genesis, and so on and so forth. The other type of game that really took off in the 16-bit era, started in arcades and hit home, was the 2D one-on-one fighting game. This started with Street Fighter, and then the Neo Geo games, World Heroes, Art of Fighting, Samurai Showdown, King of Fighters, so on and so forth. And obviously Mortal Kombat, Primal Rage, etc. There were others. And this became a big phenomenon. So the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis were both flooded with 2D one-on-one fighting games. They both had a lot of the same fighting games. Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat, Primal Rage, Samurai Showdown, etc. But they also even Rise of the Robots. They each had their own exclusive fighting games. Super Nintendo had Killer Instinct, and Sega Genesis had Eternal Champions. Now, in most cases, in like, I would say 95% of the cases, the fighting game on one system was more or less equal or identical, and for all intents and purposes, to the counterpart. So, like, Samurai Showdown on the Genesis and Samurai Showdown on the Super Nintendo are pretty much the same game. You could take a magnifying glass and go pixel by pixel, frame by frame, and find differences between the two, but we didn't do that back then. And if you're playing the game, you're not going to notice those differences anyways. You're just going to play the fucking game. Which is what we fucking did. So most people didn't even notice that some things were missing from the Genesis version of Mortal Kombat. But we did notice that the blood was missing from the Super Nintendo version of Mortal Kombat. That was very obvious. Well, the Genesis version by default didn't have blood either. You had to turn it on using one of two cheat codes, either the Dollard code or the blood code. Either or could turn on the blood. But that's nitpicking. I played Mortal Kombat on the Genesis and the Super Nintendo. I was fine. I had all 4 Mortal Kombat games that were released for both systems on both systems, and I was happy with all of them. I would happily play Mortal Kombat 2 on the Genesis. I would happily play Mortal Kombat 3 on the Super Nintendo. I'd happily play Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 on the Genesis and go back and forth. So they were all pretty good. Super Metroid is a standout on the Super Nintendo. Vector Man is a standout on the Genesis. Gunstar Heroes is a standout on the Genesis. They both had their own unique Contra. They both had their own unique Castlevania. Technically, the Genesis did have a Mega Man game on it, but it wasn't given a retail release in the US, so some people would argue it doesn't count. I'll side with them because I didn't have access to this game back in the day. So, as far as I was concerned, it didn't exist because there was no way for me to play it. So, by and large, for the most part, both consoles had their own share of arcade fighting games, and they both had their own share of RPGs and 2D platformers. Now, a third type of game that did exist pretty heavily on the NES in some capacity also became more prominent on the Super Nintendo and Genesis in the 16-bit era because we had better graphics, better sound, better controllers, so you could do more. Developers could flesh these games out. And I already talked about this on my Horror Trans podcast. This is the introduction of horror games. Horror games really became their own genre in the 16-bit era. Now, survival horror and subsequently, meaty, R-rated, adult-themed horror would come into existence later on. But there were plenty of horror games in the 16-bit era to satisfy the horror fan on both consoles. We could argue over controllers all day long. The Super Nintendo controller is fine. The Genesis controller is fine. The 6-button Genesis controller is better, but they're both good. They both had arcade sticks. They both had multi-taps. They both had light guns, etc. They were both compatible with that vest that you put on that gave you 3D interaction or whatever. They were good. Plenty of A+ racing games on both consoles. Just a lot of good games to go around. Some standouts on the Super NES, I would say, would be Donkey Kong Country, Kirby Superstar, Super Mario World, Super Castlevania 4, Mega Man X, Mega Man 7 is good, by the way. Super Star Wars, Super Empire Strikes Back, Super Return of the Jedi, those were all good. Turtles in Time was good. Tournament Fighters was good. Killer Instinct was good. Star Fox was good. Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past was damn fucking good. One of the greatest video games of all time, in my opinion. So they both had their standout titles. So a lot of the time, it really came down to whose first party titles did you prefer. Because by and large, with a handful of exceptions, they both had mostly the same third party games. They weren't always identical, but they were close enough for the most part. That's not to say there weren't some, again, cases where you had completely different games on both systems, or maybe you had the same game on both systems, but one version was clearly better than the other. So there were cases of that as well. But for the most part, I would say the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis are pretty much even as far as I'm concerned. As far as add-ons and accessories, the Super Nintendo gives you the Super Game Boy, which allows you to play monochrome 8-bit Game Boy cartridges on your Super Nintendo on your TV, adding full color as well as customizable backgrounds and other stuff, which was pretty neat. It also had a mouse, which was compatible with Mario Paint and a handful of other games. The Genesis also had a mouse, by the way. But the Genesis went a step further and did something the Super Nintendo didn't do. Nintendo almost did, and then did the one thing Sega CD, Nintendo almost did but backed away from. The second thing, 32X, Nintendo did, but they did it differently than Sega did. So, both 16-bit consoles have 32-bit 3D games in their software library. The Super Nintendo used upgrade chips built into the cartridge, the Super FX chip and other chips, to enhance the capabilities of the Super Nintendo to allow it to do 32-bit 3D games. The Genesis, on the other hand, went a different route. Instead of putting expensive chips in certain games in the cartridge for certain games to make those games stand out, they just built the chip into an add-on that you plugged into the top of your Genesis called the 32X, and then they just released a handful of enhanced games for it. So, if you isolate the 32X games and you compare them straight across to the Super FX games, and you count those both as the same thing, then they both have comparable libraries. Again, if you're not trying to stretch the 32X as its own dedicated home console, but rather as an extension of the Genesis. Same with Sega CD, which I'm going to talk about the Sega CD when I talk about CD-ROM in a future video, because that warrants its own topic of discussion. However, Nintendo ultimately backed out of releasing a CD upgrade for the Super Nintendo and went a different route, which, as you may or may not know, is what led to the creation of Sony PlayStation and so on and so forth. So, at the end of the day, the 16-bit era is one of the more interesting and more documented and discussed eras of video game history. Now, this series is titled Console Wars, and some people want to talk about the winners and losers. Now, in the Atari era, I did talk about how Atari pretty much dominated, and in the 8-bit era, I did talk about how the NES absolutely dominated. It had no legitimate, worthwhile competition. I mean, it technically had competition, but it might as well not have, considering it had 90% of the market. So the other 10% was divided up between 3 or 4 different competing consoles, so you know what I'm saying? However, things were a lot more even in the 16-bit era. From 1988 to 1995, the Sega Genesis outsold the Super Nintendo. Well, 88 to 91, 88, 89, 90, there was no Super Nintendo. It didn't exist. But 91, 92, 93, 94, 95, month to month, year to year, the Genesis outsold the Super Nintendo. Most of the time, year to date, month to date, month after month, year after year. What happened was in 1995, Sega backed off Genesis altogether. They stopped marketing it. They didn't stop manufacturing consoles, and they didn't stop making games for it, but they stopped marketing it, and they didn't make it its focus. They were pushing the 32X. They were pushing the Sega Saturn. So what they did was they shifted their focus to the 32-bit era. So they still had a handful of development houses making games for the Genesis, and third parties were still making games for the Genesis because they were still making money off of them. There was still a viable market base there. However, as far as Sega was concerned, in 1995, the Genesis was dead. However, Nintendo had one of its best years on the Super Nintendo in 1995. You got a lot of great games in 95. Donkey Kong Country, Killer Instinct were the two big ones. And then in 1996, Nintendo released the successor to the SNES, the N64, which got off to a slow start because Nintendo was also supporting the Virtual Boy, the Super Nintendo, and the Game Boy at the same time. They were spread too thin. They didn't have the resources to dump a lot of energy into making N64 games and keep making games for the other systems. It took them discontinuing making games for the Virtual Boy altogether and then shifting their console teams from Super Nintendo to N64 before they could really ramp up production of N64 games, which I would argue they never really did. Nintendo themselves did not make a lot of games on the N64. Most of the N64 games Nintendo published were made by other companies. Rare, Hudson, Treasure, etc. So, there is that. Not to say that didn't happen on the Super NES, but here's where I'm going with this. Starting in 95, Super Nintendo overtook Genesis because Sega walked away from the Genesis. And then in 96, they were still manufacturing them because they were still selling them, but it wasn't their focus, so they weren't pushing it as hard. So they weren't trying to sell it. They were just trying to stay in business. In 96, Nintendo gave the Super NES a big push again with Super Mario RPG and a handful of other big hits because the N64 wasn't quite up to speed yet. So they were transitioning. So again, 96, the Super Nintendo overtook the Genesis in sales because they were actively pushing it and releasing big, high-profile titles. 97, both Nintendo and Sega pretty much pumped the brakes on the 16-bit consoles. So neither one of them got a big push in 97. But something weird happened with Sega. Jaleco came to Sega and said, we think there's still a market here. And so they released the Genesis 3 and started selling that, a budget console. And third-party companies, like I said, were still making games for the Genesis because they weren't fully on board with the Saturn because it didn't have sales. And they didn't even know what to do with the N64, so they didn't even fucking touch it. Or they were knee-deep in PlayStation development, so they didn't have time. So software development dropped off for both 16-bit consoles in 97. So again, 97, the Super Nintendo did a little bit better. And then 98, Nintendo gave the Super Nintendo its final push, the redesigned Super Nintendo 2, which they bundled with the Super Game Boy to try to clear out Super Game Boy stock. And once again gave it a big push, so they led the sales again. So, yes, when it was all said and done, hindsight after the fact, the Super Nintendo ultimately did sell, I believe, 6 or 7 million more total consoles than the Sega Genesis, somewhere in that ballpark. However, when they were in direct head-to-head competition, the Genesis outsold the Super Nintendo every step of the way. So it is not 100% accurate to say Super Nintendo won the 16-bit generation, because it didn't. It didn't win the war. Sega gave up and conceded to Nintendo. Nintendo did not defeat Sega. So it's all a matter of perspective, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. They both have comparable software libraries, and they're both damn good systems. The Neo Geo is probably the one 16-bit console not really worth talking about all that much, other than as a footnote. Again, we're not talking about CD-ROM systems, and of course, at this point, we're not talking about computers at all, because that's a future video for another day. Stay cool.